Okay, Art Montoya the second, right?
No,
Oh,
just Arthur I. Montoya.
Arthur I. Montoya.
Yeah.
All right.
Never had that done.
Mr. Montoya, where are we today? In Palm Desert or?
We're in Palm Desert. We're in my home in Palm Desert Country Club.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
How long have you lived here?
I lived in this house 3 years. I came back after retirement from the Postal Service about the year 2000. My mother was still living and she was old and needed somebody to take care of her. So my wife and I came down. We became childless by then. All 5 children had left. So we came down after living 2 years in Visalia to take care of our mother. She passed away in 2004, and I stayed in the same home by the College of the Desert on Royal Palm Drive.
Mm-hmm. How many? There's so many Montoyas. Tell us, is this the Montoya that you're? The Montoyas. What division are you
Well,
of the Montoyas?
you know, I've got family trees. Some of these books, if you wanted to see where it starts. The Montoyas in the United States started in the 1700s. We
Right.
came over with Cortez. But my dad was born and raised in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and he got to the valley here in 1923. And once he found a job, his brothers started following him, Ramon and Arthur, my namesake, and they came over about 1928, 29. But we were related to the Gonzalez Ranch people who got here in 1904. And Mr. Gonzalez, I think, was the first Montoya. You know, Mexican people, when they come from Mexico, they always use their mother's name as their last name. So much of the legal papers that he signed is George Gonzalez Montoya. So many people say the Montoyas arrived here in 1904, but really he was a Gonzalez. But we don't have many other relatives that are Montoyas that are not related to us. There's a small family in Coachella that came later that were not related to us as far as we know. So most Montoyas are related to us. They live in the Coachella Valley. The other name is Ramirez, that's my mother's name, and there's a lot of them also. So when I have to go to the doctor, I just pick up the phone. I got many drivers willing to take me. Cousins, first cousins, second cousins.
How many would you say are the extended family? How many would you say?
Over 100. Yeah, we have almost an entire section of Coachella Valley Cemetery that I can visit on Mother's Day and Father's Day. So we can have a family reunion at the cemetery. No, it's wonderful to have that many relatives. Yeah. And too many funerals. As we get older, you know, I get a funeral this week of a Montoya. That's the sad part about it, but we also meet a lot of new Montoyas coming up too, so that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
You grew up in the Coachella Valley?
Yes.
And where did you go to high school?
Coachella Valley High School. I was born in 1939, so my high school years are 1953 to 56. At one time, all 4 of us, my 4 brothers, all were at high school together, or 1 year, within 1 year of each other. We were a very popular athletic family and academic family. Unusual for Mexican kids in that day and age to be academically and athletically inclined. And all 4 of us went to college. During this interview, I may cry. Okay. Because 2 are gone. My younger brother will be here tomorrow. My older brother was named the most successful student in the history of Coachella High School. And rightly so.
Why is that?
Well, he retired as an admiral, but he was also, and I have books on him. He was also named by the Naval Academy as one of the most outstanding graduates in their history. And there's There's acclamations by various people that say that. They called him the greatest engineer in the Annapolis history. So we're very proud of him. And he led us. You know, mothers and fathers lead, but the oldest brother makes the path, and we follow. With guidance of the parents, of course, but he was student body president and this, that, and the other. Very unusual for that time and age for Mexican kids to get those things, you know. And so he led the way. But we also had other relatives that we were very attached to, that were patriotic. My uncle Ignacio, my mother's brother, was the first person to volunteer for World War II. And it's called during the clippings that I've got, Coachella Valley's first volunteer. And my dad's brother, Natividad, died in World War II as a CB. Our cousin Herman Granados, which is the American Legion post that India was named after, was the first person killed in World War II from the Coachella Valley. So that atmosphere we grew up in, that atmosphere of patriotism and do the right thing and serve and those kinds of things were ingrained in us as kids.
In what way were they ingrained in you?
By pictures on the walls and flags on the walls, and I've got scrapbooks of every volunteer that served, that my mother knew, and we would go over them. We had maps on our walls during World War II where the uncle was and where the cousin was. And we had another, my dad's brother was killed in World War I, in the Battle of Chateau-Thierry in France, 1918, right before the war ended. So serving your country was something that was part of your life. You did it some way. All three of my brothers are veterans. I'm not, but I served 35 years of the Postal Service. I call that tough duty. It was tough sometimes. But yeah, in that way, I guess, there were some articles in the paper some years ago, and I've got the articles saying that we ought to send our immigrants back home. They're not really patriots. I wrote an article that they published in the paper, don't ever call us non-patriots. And I wrote the history of my family. And I never got a response from the man that wrote that first article. But no, we're patriots.
Where did you send that article?
The Indio Daily News, I think it was called, or the Date Palm, one of the two. It was a paper that no longer exists.
Do you still have that letter?
Yes, it's in. I'm going to show it to you
I
guys
wanna
and show
see
it to
that
you.
letter,
Okay. Okay.
What was your interest in high school? Tell me about high school. What was that like?
My oldest brother was a straight A student, and I did everything in the world to be opposite of him, because I was a little rascal through grammar school, high school. But I was a decent student, but I didn't know what I wanted to be. You know, we didn't have counselors in those days, no role models. The whole world was white, either white teacher, white male teacher, white female teacher. We never saw anybody. Our Spanish teachers were even white people, you know, lovely people. I don't want to denigrate them, but we didn't have a role model. We didn't say, I want to be a pharmacist or a doctor. We didn't see, we wanted to be a good farm worker. My dad raised us to being the number one thing that I can give you guys is be a hard worker. Give your employer more than he has contracted you for. Give him 10% more. So I didn't know what, I did know I wanted to play baseball and I wanted to play football as long as I could do that. So I went to Orange Coast College after high school and played 2 years of college football. And I'm not a big guy, but I played in the line. And I played baseball. And I went to New Mexico State and found out that the football players were getting bigger and bigger. And I was getting slower and smaller. So I decided to stick to baseball. So I was a captain of their baseball team. So I went to New Mexico State, which is located in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where my dad is from. And I met a lot of relatives there, some of my ancestors. And I went there 3 years and decided that I was going to become a school teacher. And one day I was practice teaching at Las Cruces High School, and they had a break room for the teachers, and I went in there to watch them, listen to them, have my coffee or whatever. And so all I could hear was complaints about how dumb their job was, how the principal was this. I mean, it was complained, and I asked myself, do I want a life like this, of being dissatisfied with my job? So I quit teaching, advancing my credential, and basically I quit college. I went to work as an insurance agency, as an insurance person in Las Cruces. Didn't make any money, so I came home. Worked in construction, and joined the 2030 Club in Indio.
What's that?
Which is I don't know if it exists anymore. I hope it does, because it was a club of young Mexican American business people. It was kind of like the JCs. You know what the JCs are? But it was Mexican American in Indio. They had a JCs in Indio, but segregated. So the 2030 Club came around of young men ages 20 to 30 that were trying to find a profession. So we had people there that were insurance agents, and a lot of retail people, worked in grocery stores and wanted to become managers and those kinds of things, who said that you're a college kid, but I bet you couldn't even pass a Postal Service exam. And I said I could take that Postal Service exam if I had a hangover. We had a bet. So we did everything responsible to get a hangover one evening, and the Postal Service exam was given the next day, and I aced it. I had a good score, and I didn't intend to work for the Postal Service. I was enjoying my life as an insurance agent. But they called me in Palm Desert to work, and my mother just went bananas. She said, "You gotta go to work for the government." "Why, Mom?" She says, "Because during the Depression, nobody had jobs except the postal guys. They all had jobs, son. You'll always have a job." My mother was really conscious of being poor. And I said, "Well, I'll give it a shot, Mom." So I went to work as a temporary employee, working split shifts in 1963. By 1968, I was the postmaster. So that's the story of that little 6-year period of my life.
Where was the location of the post office at that time?
Do you know where the post office is on El Paseo now, the old post office? Right across the street. There's a building, if you look at it real careful, it has double doors, double glass doors, just like post office used to have. You'd open them up. That was the post office that I grew up in. Yeah. It's the only building that I know on that whole street that has a basement. We used to store stuff down in the basement of that building. But it's not a big basement, but it has a basement. But it got too small fast, Palm Desert. In 1963, we had 2 letter carriers. Maybe the third one started. Every year we'd had 2 as the place would grow. Indian Wells started growing. Palm Desert Country Club started growing, and then across the wash, the Dream Homes and all those areas along Portola. And by the college started building up and more houses came.
When was that? What were the years that you're referring to right now?
I'm referring to when I was in the post office, 1963 to 68. The first major, it was a funny story, you know where Palm Desert Greens is, the mobile home park? Well, everybody referred to those places as trailer parks. And when you had a vision of a trailer park, it was something that was just trailers. The Postal Service had a rule that you don't deliver mail to a trailer. You deliver to a central location where all the people can come to a clubhouse and pick up their mail. But these people came in with a lot of money, and they built a golf course, and these fabulous mobile homes built on them, not ever intended to be trailers. So there was no definition of them in any of our regulations. So we talked to them, and I told them what we could do. We'd put a mailbox in between every mobile home. So that's the way they got mail delivered there. But it took some negotiating with my bosses that was not a trailer park as described in any manual that we had. It may have been one of the fanciest mobile home parks in the United States. And it's still beautiful. I don't know if you've been out there in that place. Still gorgeous. But we had to, the 60s was really an interesting and involved area in Palm Desert. I was looking up some things in my notes. July 20, 1969, I wrote down, was the night that we landed on the moon. And it was a night of a murder in Palm Desert that became as big a headlines as the moon landing. The man named Jack Hale, who was the president of the Palm Desert Chamber of Commerce, and he was a good friend. When you're postmaster, you're friends with the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce and those people. He's not the kind of friend that I play golf with or play poker with, but business friend. He was sitting at his house watching this moon landing with his family. And he lived on Magnesia Falls, which was the road that separated Rancho Mirage and Palm Desert, still does today. But he was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Rancho Mirage had not yet evolved into chambers of commerce and those kinds of things. So he's sitting in his chair, and his house has a fence around it, a wooden fence, and somebody stood, and evidence showed that he stood for hours on the other side of the fence and aimed a rifle, and he shot Jack right through the head while his family was in the living room with him. And it was never solved until a man died in Texas, something like 10 years later, who was a head of a hairdresser organization. His ex-wife thinks he did it, but it was never solved. And it lasted for years, a mystery of Jack Hale's death. And that happened in first year that I was postmaster.
What was it like in the city when it was a murder?
Sure.
So what was it like around when there was a murder?
Well, because there were so many theories. Palm Desert was, I don't remember where we were a city yet. I can't remember, I don't know the dates of our cityhood. It's about the same.
73.
Okay, so it's about that time that committees were being formed to begin petitions to become a city. I was on the first committee to explore cityhood, to get into what's called LAFCO, Local Agency Formation Committee. I was a treasurer of that committee for a while. I resigned for a reason that I don't know if I want to tell you, but because it involves some people that may still be alive, and I don't want to involve them. But we were forming a committee, and Jack Hale may have been on that committee, but I don't have a list. I know Ed Welcome from Welcome Real Estate was on it, and a guy named Dwayne Wheeler, who was a good friend of Richard Nixon, was on it, and we formed an outline of what we think the city should be, looked like the boundaries of it, and started raising money. And this thing happened about that time. So it was people that worked on there saying, does somebody not want us to become a city, going to knock us all off? I mean, there was a lot of theories. Jack was an insurance man, and maybe somebody that he didn't serve properly did it. I mean, there were so many theories, but nobody got caught.
Do you have, as an aside, do you have any kind of newspaper articles
No.
on that? Okay.
No, I just have a good memory of it.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, I bet you could find it in the Desert Sun.
Mm-hmm.
Look up July 20, 1969. The Palm Desert had a newspaper in those days, and I can't remember when that started, the Palm Desert Post, and that covered some of the local news like that. You probably have that in your archives, don't you? Yeah.
You mentioned an Indio newspaper too. What was?
There was two newspapers. There were three newspapers on this side of the valley that were the dominant newspapers other than the Desert Sun in the Coachella Valley. Going back a little bit when I went to high school, you remember that was the only high school, and then there was Palm Springs. So every child that was going to school between what's now Bob Hope Drive, it was called Rio del Sol, clear to Desert Center, to the Salton Sea, went to Coachella High School. So kids knew each other. We were one neighborhood. We played football in a packed stadium at Coachella High School. Half the kids that played football were today's Palm Desert kids. Gary Olson was a good football player. Joe Rodarty, the Rodarty brothers, the RC brothers. They were all from Palm Desert. But we used to ride buses to go to school and hitchhike to get home. Hitchhiking was a common thing, and people would look for us to bring us home. Friendly businessmen from India or the area around the high school. So the Palm Desert, the Indio Daily News and the Desert Palm were competitors, and then they, what do you call it, consolidated, amalgamated, merged, and became a newspaper till about 10 years ago. I think they were still alive, maybe 20, I don't know. But it covered Palm Desert Grammar School. When I graduated from Palm Desert Grammar School, the ceremonies were in Indio at the fairgrounds with all the kids that went to Indio Grammar School. We had one giant class. I have programs that'll show that. And it doesn't distinct, it doesn't say Arthur Montoya Palm Desert and Joe Gomez Indio. It just says graduates from an Indio high school, from the Indio school district. That was it. That was it. So we were one community. We didn't become various communities until the various cities incorporated.
When you were on the committee, did you talk about what you wanted the border to be? I've read different things about why.
I have a map of what they thought the border would be. I do have a map that we'll dig into this stuff. Are you guys going to come back again another day? You need to tell me what you need, and I'll have that separated. But I have maps that show what Palm Desert should be, or what it's going to be. And there's a difference, by the way, between what the Postal Service maps are showing Palm Desert and what the city does. The post office doesn't care about incorporation. They decide what's in their benefit, zip coded wise, and all of that. So some of the fights were between Palm Desert and Rancho Mirage when they started getting big. Rancho Mirage had a reputation of being a trailer park city when we were growing up, poor. When Mr. Annenberg moved in, that he wanted a Palm Desert address. And at that time, the Eisenhower Hospital was starting to develop. They had an office in Palm Desert, fundraising office, an organizing office, and they wanted a Palm Desert address. So they were on this side of Bob Hope Drive, but the Annenbergs were on that side. So Rancho Mirage had yet to develop its mail delivery system. They just had to go to the post office and pick up your mail. But they started to grow. So I told the Annenbergs, if you had your entrance on Bob Hope Drive, I can service you, but I can't go down Frank Sinatra Drive and service you. So they didn't like that. So they wrote to Washington, etc., and Washington backed me up because the Postal Service had already established their boundary. The minute we went into that in the Annenberg area, we'd have to serve clear through 111, the Frank Sinatra Drive, clear down to Cathedral City, just about, you know. So that was a nice fight in those days about what address do you want. But Rancho Mirage now has a magnificent name, you know, it's a beautiful name, but not in those days. There was a negative name.
That Rancho Mirage became, did the Annenbergs part of that?
No, Rancho Mirage has been around since before I was born. Rancho Mirage is older than Palm Desert. There was Indio, Point Happy. Indian Wells was a name because they had a real Indian well over here along the highway. And they had a market, 2 markets. So Indian Wells was the name, and then you went into Palm Village. Palm Desert was not anything until World War II and Cliff Henderson came around. But it was Palm Village, and they had a plunge where kids could swim, and a place where you could buy a date shake, you know. And then Rancho Mirage. And Rancho Mirage had ranches. We worked in ranches. I worked on a ranch right across the street from what is now the Eisenhower Hospital and the Springs Country Club. There was a huge grape ranch, and that was owned by a guy, sometime my memory fails me.
Kirsten?
Kirsten, Mr. Kirsten, thank you. the Kirsten Ranch. There's a street named after him back in that Springs area. But I worked for Mr. Kirsten for a year. Yeah.
I
But
heard, it was true that over there is very fertile soil?
Very fertile soil for some reason. And my guess is that the runoff before they got to Whitewater would come off those mountains and just flood the area like La Quinta. One of the problems in La Quinta when we lived there was the floods would come off that mountain and would flood. It would never flood our area, but it would flood where the La Quinta Hotel is now and form great big giant clay. The clay would surface and we'd have this much of clay on top. So we would play with the clay as kids.
Let's see, La Rosa Ranch was what other ranches were over there?
In Rancho Mirage,
Mm-hmm.
I recognize a ranch called El Rancho Escondido.
Oh.
The foreman of that ranch was a family of John Tawada. I was asking somebody the other day, funny that you'd asked, whether he was Mexican or Filipino, because that name is so strange. And they said, no, he's a Mexican guy. And a young lady that just passed away last Friday, who worked at the college for a number of years, her family was raised in that area, the Contreras family. But you know what's funny about ranch names? Let me give you an example. A very wealthy family owned a ranch right at the end of where Washington ends and then turns left on Avenue 52. That ranch, I have no idea what the name of it is, but the people that owned it when I was growing up were the
Kavanaugh?
No, Kavanaugh's over here.
Mm-hmm.
This is La Quinta. Anyway, they're absentee owners. So the ranches, we called them, were the name of the family that ran the ranch.
Yeah.
The Dollins Ranch, the Juana Ranch, not the name of the owner of the ranch. So that's why some of the names, there are some names along the highway here that were also absentee, but they were named after their owners. That Cook Ranch, Mr. Cook, was always there. He's been there since the 1910s, I think. Cook Street's named after him. But the Rancho La Quinta, I'll think of the name in a minute, because there's a street in LA named after that family. But that was the Dollins Ranch to us, and the Blocker Ranch down the street. I don't know who owned it. The Patterson Ranch was owned by the Pattersons. They had a big goat farm and burro farm and flower farm along the highway. But some of the other ranches, I don't know what their real names were.
What is the definition of a ranch? How big would a ranch be?
I don't know. That's a good question, because what's a ranch? What's a farm?
Yeah.
A farm to us was tomatoes, corn, potatoes, crops that you grew every year, that you had to grow. A ranch was date trees. A grove was the citrus trees. A ranch grove usually was accompanied by citrus in between the rows. But in Texas, a ranch has got to be 1,000 acres. Here, 40 acres gave you a good-sized ranch and a good living with tomatoes and corn, okra. And we had a few cotton ranches along where PGA West is now, way in that corner of the cove, but not in this side. It was a very fertile ground for tomatoes.
I heard somebody once told me that
And grapes.
that when you look at Coachella Valley and all the date trees, that 80% of the date trees were planted by Montoya.
My father. I got the article.
So that is true.
Well, that's what he says. Who knows what's true? Like there's an old movie, if it's between fact or fiction, print the fiction. It's not for. I don't know. I don't know. But I do have an article. There it is, right there. I think. If it wouldn't have been for my mother, he would not have been as good a dad. But he got here in 1923 as a 16-year-old boy, and he went to work for his cousin George Gonzalez Montoya, and he was working there for 2 weeks, and On the third week, he said, "When do I get paid?" He said, "Paid? We're feeding you, we're housing you, we're clothing you. That's your pay." He quit. And he went to work for a brand new organization by the University of California, had built a experimental station in Indio to study agriculture, especially dates. They wanted to know what kind of dates would grow here. The valley had started bringing in dates around 1905, 1910 from Saudi Arabia and a couple other countries. Some Indio people were in Saudi Arabia and helped them with their water systems. They discovered dates, and they discovered the land was just like ours. So they started shipping the dates through Yuma, through the railroad, and they dropped them off in Thermal. But the experimental station was in Indio, which was now Miles Avenue, the name of the first guy. There's a street named after him, the first professor. He hired my dad because my dad spoke perfect English and perfect Spanish. And all the employees that they had could only speak Spanish, so he needed to get the information from the mayordomo. He became the mayordomo, the major domo, at 17 years old. But he learned the idiosyncrasies of the date business, which is really a strange business because dates have a male and a female, and you have to know the difference between the two. And you get the offshoots from the female, and you get the offshoot, and you plant it. And then you have to have 10 males and 1 female, or vice versa. I don't know. I did not grow in the date business, but my dad did that for years.
So he propagated dates around the
whole
around
valley.
the whole valley.
Yeah, the whole valley. Him and his crew. I've got pictures of them. I still have pictures of them planting the dates and cutting the dates and trimming the dates. Yeah, he was. Palm Desert recognized him as one of their first citizens. Then he brought my uncle Art from Las Cruces and his brother Ramon from Las Cruces to help him in that business. But he was a real energetic, smart guy. He had 2 years of high school, which was a lot in those days, a lot in the 20s. So he could read and write Spanish and English, and had an opinion about anything he wanted to talk about. But he was not as fine as my grandfather. So here's my grandfather. In Las Cruces, New Mexico, he was part of the statehood, Natividad Montoya, a little short guy here. I've got the actual plaque in the back, in my back room. He was on the school board in 1915 of the La Doña Ana School District. Again, that eagerness to participate in your community, he didn't stay in the background. He actually did something. So my dad took a lot of pride in his father, as I take pride in my father, and I would hope my children take some pride in me.
When you work for does some of the people supply the places to live? Did some of the people on the ranches, did they give housing to the workers?
Yes. Most of the workers are males, braceros, the bracero program, or illegals. Bracero meant legal, green card. In our rancho La Quinta, as an example, the owner of the place, the absentee owner, gave us a house, an adobe house, towards the front of the property. And towards the back of the property, there was a combination packing house and a rooming house, where they had showers, indoor toilets, and those kinds of things. But the beds were in a row, like an army barrack would be. They didn't have individual, because there was no families, no women. They were all. I think the most we ever had was like 12 men lived there. We had horses and goats, and they would help us break in the horses. They were very skilled at that. And Dad would use them, and other local people that lived in the valley would also work on our farms and ranches. But yeah, he accommodated 10 or 12 people. The most interesting days of our lives would be when we got a raid by the immigration people. And they would come in, and the person that they would talk to better know a little bit of English, or they'd send them back to Mexico. So my dad would teach him English. Where were you born? Detroit, Indio, someplace, you know. You got papers? My brother has them. They knew enough to talk about like that. And we had some real friendly border patrolmen. Some of their kids went to school with us, and they would tell us, tell your dad we're going to visit him tomorrow.
Yeah.
So in those days, we had this dorm with 12 beds and 2 guys sleeping in it. So where are the others? We get them all from downtown. We don't have any others.
So
We were told in advance many times that there's going to be a raid. Much more friendlier atmosphere than today. Yeah.
well, if you were living on that, in that sort of that place, where were the women, and how did you connect with having a family?
Well, those people didn't have families.
Oh, okay.
They would go. They'd earn their pay. They'd go back to Mexico, and they'd come back, leave their family in Mexico. But we hired Mexican ladies that my mother grew up with to become the tomato packers, or the corn packers, or the dates are packed differently. They're packed at a central location in Indio. Indio had large plants that had they would fumigate dates to make sure there were no bugs on them, so they couldn't pack them locally. But we hired local help, and then we had to haul our dates to L.A. Our market was Los Angeles, so we had truckers that had their business, and they were all well-known family people too that my folks went to high school with. My mother went through high school here through 1932, so she grew up with these kids, and they were World War II vets that grew up with her brothers. So they were born and raised here. The guys that ran the trucks.
How long would it take for a truck to go to Los Angeles to make a delivery?
You pick up the date, the tomatoes at the close of business around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, maybe 7, depending on how large the crop was that day. We were the last stop on a trip that they took at various farms, and from our place they went to L.A. and they had to be there before midnight because the market would be open the next morning, and they had to be first in line to unload. So they'd have to stay there for it to be unloaded. Then they bring empty boxes back to bring back to our farms the next morning. So how long it took to get there? For them, it was like a 12-hour trip, because it was hours to get there, hours to wait, hours to reload, come back. Then they'd sleep, and start again the next day. So it
You
was
would go how many days a week? 6 days a week there?
every day,
Really?
except Saturday night, because we wouldn't work, because the markets weren't open on Sunday. So whatever you picked up today was tomorrow's market. And there's a street here. This street here is Miles Avenue,
Yeah.
which is right out here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right now the tennis gardens is right here. There's the Whitewater River. Miles Avenue connects, at the end of Miles Avenue, we lived on a ranch that we grew dates, yams, corn, tomatoes. It was a large ranch. All these people would come to us. We were the first farmers market in the area.
What was the name of the farmer's market?
We were the farmers market
Yeah.
now, just a market.
Yeah.
People would just drive up and said, how much for the tomatoes? But anyway, Miles Avenue, I'm going to stick to that story because it ends at Indio.
Way down.
Do you know what Miles Avenue is named after? Okay, that's the story that nobody knows, and it's really an important story.
Good.
It's named after Nelson A. Miles, the first Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He served in the Civil War. He grew up in the Army as an Army officer, became a general, was responsible for murdering Indians. If you Google him, it'll say Nelson A. Miles, Indian fighter. And I said, what a rotten name to name a guy from Indian Wells to Indio, which also means Indian. And there was a lot of Indian tribes around here, and they named the main highway after him. My wish is to name it after my brother Benjamin, an admiral that was raised there, born in Indio, and raised at the end of that street. That's my story, but I don't know who to talk to about it. It's too old for me to campaign. But Nelson A. Miles' name should not be in this valley. He was responsible for one of the biggest massacres in Colorado. His men were. He didn't personally massacre anybody. But when you're the general, you're responsible for your men. Those men, it's a very famous Indian battle, but they kill men, women, and children.
What's the name of the battle?
I'm trying to remember it and I can't think of it, but I will. I'll get you that information. But
I could ask the mayor of Palm Desert. It's time they do stuff like that now.
well, the whole world is changing with Confederate statues and
Yeah.
and people whose names were prominent then, but looking behind and looking in the closets, they're not so prominent. It's shameful that they were heroes in those days. I can't take anything away from Nelson Miles. In his day and time, he did what he was supposed to do. But I'm sure Germany doesn't have a highway named after Hitler or after a German general. So we have to look at things and bring them up to date.
Absolutely.
I believe that. Anyway, that would be.
See if we can do something for you. At least.
And I will give you. Well, you can look up Nelson A. Miles. I don't want to be your only source
Okay.
on Nelson A. Miles, but I've read a lot about him.
Were you involved in that campaign to change the Arab?
No, I was
Oh.
against that.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, because I was not a strong advocate either way,
Yeah.
but I grew up with the old Arab, but I knew the young lady who painted that picture. But we have I have a T-shirt that has all the Arabs' history on my T-shirt. But I have no problem with what they wanted. We had an Arab with a fez for a long time while I was in school. You know what a fez is? Rather than a turban. A fez was the Ottoman Empire. It was not an Arab. So I can understand why they wanted that gone. But the Arab that they had on there was a mean-looking guy. He looked like my brother, one of my brothers. Big mustache and a growly face. But they made it to make us tough football players. They wanted an Arab that looked like Rudolph Valentino. You know, a kind of nice-looking guy, you know. More, just like we talked about Nelson A. Miles, they wanted an Arab for today's Arab world. And at first they wanted no Arab at all. And I said, no, this country, this part of the valley was raised and their commerce was dates, and the fair was always the Arabian Nights pageant and the 1001 Nights. Those kind of stories were always told. So I was on the committee that opposed it, and we compromised it. I was in the alumni committee that did that. But that got us good free publicity all over the United States. But that was good. Yeah.
Did you know that building where is the Coachella Valley Historic Museum?
Yes.
Were you familiar with that building before
Yes.
it was a museum?
Yes. It was a dental office
Yeah.
right across the street from the Indian Women's Club. It was a dental office as long as I can remember.
Did you go to that dinner?
No, we didn't go. Mexican kids don't go to dentists. we went to eyeglasses because we couldn't see anymore. But I never had my teeth washed, cleaned, or anything until I got to college. No, we heard the wealthy people went to dentists.
I see.
No.
How about downtown, just generally downtown Indio?
Oh, downtown Indio. You know, my dream in life growing up was someday live in Indio. We lived in ranches over there in La Quinta. We grew up in a farm labor camp in Indio, which was a lovely place to grow up because we had so many friends right next door,
Yeah.
black, brown, the Okie an Archie adventure into California all stopped at the Indio farm labor camp in the 30s and 40s. So it was mixed up of every race imaginable. And we had a lot of fun growing up together, and I still have friends from those days. But the war ended in 1946, so we moved to a ranch that a fellow had bought over here in La Quinta. But I still have friends. My brother still had friends. My brother was an admiral. Would come home, would call a guy named Charlie Spencer, who we all grew up with, at the farm labor camp. And they'd sit around and talk just like we're talking now. We never forgot those friends because they were good friends, friends for life. Went to high school, grammar school together, high school together, that kind of thing. One high school to remember.
So you guys did notice the effect of the Dust Bowl on California?
Oh yeah,
All these people.
the
coming
people.
in?
Oh, absolutely. Along the there were two major things that happened while we were at the farm labor camp, which is right next to the railroad tracks in Indio. It's on Van Buren Street. There's a row of tamarack trees. You know what tamarack or tamarisk? They call them the same. Right alongside that is a windbreaker. The poor Okies would live under these tamarack trees till they had enough money to move into the labor camp. Some would move on to Bakersfield, but the trek was right through that area. They'd get off the railroad, or they'd come in their old ugly cars. It seemed like everybody had a car to fix. They called them shade tree mechanics. We'd see them under there, and we played with them. One day I ditched school, and my mother went over there in the trees and said, "Arthur, are you up there?" And about 12 kids fell out of those trees. We would, all black and white and brown kids jumped, and my mother chased us to school. We had a small school at the farm labor camp. But the other thing that happened in World War II, these railroad tracks would unload tanks and jeeps and warfare here, and they'd park them at a large lot next to the farm labor camp. And they would bring to Palm Desert, some of the smaller craft. The other ones they'd take up to Shaver Summit or Desert Center, whatever that's called. But we would watch them unload. We crossed the line and got inside a tank. And we were playing in there when my oldest cousin was looking out the porthole and saw a Jeep coming. So we tried to get out, but I was only about 4 years old. I couldn't get out. And I thought, man, they're going to arrest me. I'm in prison the rest of my life. So they yelled at us. My cousin stayed, pulled me out, and he saluted them. He must have been 12. And they said, "Get out of here, boys," etc., etc. And I was so frightened that we were going to get shot or something. We never went back to that place. But we remember that. And then my dad would work at the Kavanaugh Ranch. He was a foreman at the Kavanaugh Ranch, and he had some property that he had to take care of for somebody in Palm Desert. So we'd come up here with my dad and see on the left-hand side of the street only would be the Army tanks and different kind of trucks. On the right side, there was a market and a place where you could get an ice cream cone. And my dad had planted some trees in that area.
Why do you think the Kavanaugh adobe is still there where other
Oh,
things
that
are
was
not?
so pretty. It was known in those days as the best water in the valley. You know, we didn't have refrigeration in those days, but we would come to the Kavanaugh Ranch just to drink water. It was fresh. It was cold coming out. It must have had a deep well or something. But he had it was a beautiful house. Is that the house on the hill? I can't remember anymore. It's kind of on a mound, but it was long house, you know, just picturesque ranch house. And he only had the one daughter, but it was a big house. And he had grapes and the dates. And what a wonderful man he was. He was great to my dad, and he was really good to us. And he was responsible, directly or indirectly, for my brother to get into the Naval Academy through a story that I can tell you later. But it's a good story. But
Mr. Kavanaugh?
yeah, he sold 20 acres to a fellow named Palmer, right where the Indian Wells Hotel is now. And that was right across the street from where we live, kind of catty corner at Rancho Pasatiempo, they called it, my dad's ranch. They had need for a packer for their small 10 acres of grapes and somebody to help load the grapes into a truck to bring to the packing house. So they asked my mother to be the packer. Mr. Kavanaugh told Mr. Palmer, go to the Montoya family, they'll give you all the help you need. So we went over there, and I was only like 14 years old, but I could drive a truck, and I would pick up the grapes, and bring them to the packing house. My mother and a couple other ladies would pack them. Well, the man, Mr. Palmer, had a son-in-law by the name of Dusty Dornan. Dusty Dornan was a famous World War II submarine commander. He had come to visit one day, and he got acquainted with my mom, and Mr. Kavanaugh said, hey, Dusty, you need to meet her oldest son, who's right across the street. Ben was working on the farm. He was a senior. He had graduated that year. So this was 1953. And he had applied to Cal Poly, and he got accepted at a baseball scholarship. He said, you need to talk to him at the Naval Academy. He's a born leader, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Dusty said, have your boy bring his scrapbook, bring everything he's got. I want to talk to him. So they had a conversation the next day. We didn't know anything about it, Annapolis. Well, we always kidded ourselves. We thought that's where the racetrack was, where they ran the Indianapolis 500. Now, Annapolis is a city in Maryland. We were ignorant of the East Coast. So the two got together, and Dusty called the athletic director at the Naval Academy, told him about Ben, that he was a pitcher, football player, straight A student, student body president, et cetera, et cetera. And those two got together and got Ben a presidential appointment. And I've got those letters. And I'll give you copies of them. Yeah.
What's Lane Gray or Zane Gray?
Gray. You don't know who Zane Gray is?
Yeah, I know.
My gosh.
Good-looking cowboy, right?
Yeah. Good-looking cowboy. No, he's a writer.
Oh, okay.
He was a writer. Riders of the Purple Sage is a Zane Grey novel. We used to always talk about reading that novel. It's the story of Mormons in Utah and their fight to maintain their land, etc. But they made a movie of that. They made the movie about it at least twice. One TV movie. Zane Grey was a writer that had a farm. There's two farms, and I'm a little bit confused about as to the location. One was owned by Edgar Bergen, Charlie McCarthy's, and what's her lady's Bergen's name? The movie star? No, the movie star lady.
Candace Bergen?
No, Candace. Yes. Their ranch was right across the street from where the Palm Desert Charter School is now. Kind of across the street and towards the wash. The Zane Grey Ranch was somewhere in that area, but I don't know where. Because there was also another writer that had a ranch towards Thermal, and I get the two confused. Edgar Rice Burroughs had a ranch, the writer of Tarzan. But the Zane Grey Ranch, I think, was on where Portola ends, that area there. But you'd have to do more research on that.
Something about the Oasis. It was near an oasis. The Oasis, something or other.
I can't help you much.
Bud Findler.
No, don't know him.
Did you know the people that owned the Bergen Ranch before Bergen?
No.
Because it was Roberta Seaton and Bill Seaton, and Bill Seaton was a sheriff, owned the first ranch in Palm Springs, and he had the second pilot's license.
Really?
In the United States.
Yeah.
But we've been looking into them and trying to find out more about them.
Well, we had an airport right here. You know, we had an airport, the Desert Air Airport. You've seen that.
Was that the
Pictures
one
of
in
it.
Bermuda Dunes or the one in Thermal?
No, the one in Palm Desert.
Oh, Palm Desert.
Right there in the where the what's the name of that place? Right across from the movie theaters, that little resort there. It's on Bob Hope Drive, before you hit.
Oh, like the Regal Theater?
Yeah, right across from the Regal Theater, that hotel complex.
Mm-hmm.
You ever see a movie called The Mad World?
Yes.
That's in that movie, that airport, where they're trying to land that crazy airplane, goes through it's all in the clubhouse. It takes place in the clubhouse and the tower at that airport.
Did you know the people that ran it?
I knew the owner because we also worked for him. But I'm gonna take a time out on that one. I'm sure we knew him. My dad knew him well. And we had cousins. It was a farm also. And I can't think of his name. There's a street named after him also in that area. Wow, I can't remember his name.
What about that big flood? What happened with the big flood?
Well, there's been 2 or 3 floods. As I mentioned, La Quinta had 2 or 3 of them. Palm Desert, I only recall one in Palm Desert where we were living here. When the whitewater wash just destroyed everything and widened itself, and it flooded right and left. But I don't remember a whole lot about it. You know, there wasn't too many people living around that area. So we had floods, but they didn't destroy any homes that I can recall. In La Quinta, they did destroy homes. The waters came into the houses.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't remember the big one in Palm Desert very well. I remember the flood in a nice lady named Garcia lost her son in that one, I'm recalling. She lived right down the street from us after we moved to Portola Avenue, crossing the bridge in Cathedral City before it was a bridge there. He was killed going to work.
Do you mind if I ask you a little bit about your wife?
You can ask all you want.
Okay. Alyssa or Elisa?
Right there.
She's beautiful.
She was.
Yeah.
You want me to cry some more?
Aw. Is it Elisa or Alyssa?
Maria Elisa, Elisa, short for Elizabeth.
I see something here, Elisa Franco?
Franco is her maiden name.
You were married 51 years. And she was born in Chihuahua, Mexico.
Yep,
Yeah?
yep. Sure, my grandfolks were born too.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. There's a town in Chihuahua called Meoqui, Meoqui, that probably supplied 50 to 60% of every Mexican that lived in the Coachella Valley. For some reason, during the Pancho Villa era, they left there. Whether they were for Pancho or against Pancho, I don't know. But they were losing the war, and they left there. My grandfather left there. He was born in 1860. He left there when he was 15 years old, so 1875. He went to Las Cruces, New Mexico, and others followed. George Gonzalez, who came directly from Meoqui into this area, got here in 1904. But there's a lot of families here, and you ask them, where are your grandfolks from? Oh, a little town you never heard of, Meoqui. Heard of it? Yeah, it's a bigger city now.
Hank Gogarty.
Gogarty,
And
the
his-
Gogarty Ranch.
And his nephew was Dan Callahan.
Yes, I knew them both. I didn't personally know them. I knew of them, you know, they were older than me. The Gogarty Ranch and the Callahans. And there was a ranch behind them too. The Dinglers, did they ever come up to you? We knew them because they had kids our age. They had the first dude ranch, I guess you would call it. People would rent horses and run around that area.
White Sun.
White Sun Guest Ranch. That's right. You're good. Well, been here only 3 years. Ian and Diane Dingler, red-headed, freckle-faced kids, nicest kids in the whole world. And one of them contributed just in the last year, really expensive piano to the Coachella Valley High School. Really expensive piano in the thousands of dollars. But yeah, they were nice kids, brilliant students. I know they went on to someplace and became something, but I don't know why.
I think they went to Texas.
To Texas, yeah. Yeah, White Sun Guest Ranch.
Was Bermuda, is Bermuda Dunes an area?
It was
then, or-
never an area then. It was an area then. I shouldn't say that.
Was it Palm Desert? or-
No, Palm Desert stopped. Even Palm Desert Country Club was not Palm Desert from the beginning. City delivery limits was, but not the corporate. Bermuda Dunes, how could I describe Bermuda Dunes? Maybe like La Quinta in those days. La Quinta is also a late city. When you say, well, I used to bike ride when I got back and retired in 2000. We lived in Palm Desert, and I'd bike ride to La Quinta, to a restaurant right over here in the corner. And I tell my mother I went all the way to La Quinta. You can't go that far. To her, La Quinta was that cove, only that cove. Everything else was space, you know. But Bermuda Dunes was also a couple of farms. They had a lake, Carter Lake, good sized lake. I took a girl out there once. I got my truck stuck. I couldn't get out. I had to get help. That girl never dated me ever again. It was so embarrassing. I was a junior in high school. But it was, my brothers worked there helping a guy by the name of Sharman. You know who Bill Sharman is? Bill Sharman is a Hall of Fame basketball player, basketball coach, one of the few people in history that played Major League Baseball and was in a World Series and also was a world champion in basketball for the Boston Celtics. He's one of the top 50 great basketball players of all time. Well, his brother owned a ranch here, and his daughter still lives here in Palm Desert someplace. His brother also took a liking to Ben and would take him to USC basketball games where Bill Sharman was playing. So we got very well acquainted with him. He had a big ranch, and they used to water grapes in those days and alfalfa, not through the system where you see now with furrows, but sprinkler systems. Great big giant sprinkler systems with giant wheels that you had to push to get the next rows done. So Ben and my other cousins, the Chavez boys, would do the pushing and do the regenerating. They'd take apart the pipes and put them in the next rows and bring them down. But yeah, that was Bermuda Dunes, and there was no homes there. There was 2 or 3 ranches. There was land for sale. My cousins bought 3 or 4 acres. You could buy cheap land in Bermuda Dunes. But they wish they owned those 3 acres now.
Was that Del Safari Country Club? Was that Palm Desert or was that Bermuda Dunes back then?
That was Palm Desert. Del Safari, I was one of the first golfers in Del Safari. I promised them good city delivery, and they promised me free golf. They started building houses. That's all they had was a trailer when they had a golf course there. So we played golf and nobody else was around. It's called something else now. I still call it Del Safari.
Avondale?
Avondale. But Del Safari was way out of town. And we said, why did they build that? That was built even before Palm Desert Greens. And nice guy that was the foreman that was a builder there. But we wondered, because that was windy out there. Windy Point, we always called that whole area. Now it's full of houses. But it's a beautiful area on Country Club Drive. Yeah. Del Safari. I forget the name of the guy. I wish I knew his name. I don't know, I don't even know who built it.
Is the desert as windy as it used to be, or is it more windy or less windy?
Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that, because I lived in the cove over there, so I judged it by that. And I grew up in Palm Desert along the mountain, and you judge it by that. When I moved out here, I said, God dang, is it windy? I never lived in this part of the town. So, but we did have some terrible winds. 1 o'clock, we looked towards the pass. If you couldn't see the pass, it was going to be a bad day. And it was going to be very, very windy. We had so many ball games that had to be stopped because of the wind. And another funny thing happened during those days. I was asking somebody about it recently, and it doesn't happen anymore. But the insurance companies that would insure your car would also insure wind damage. And my dad would get 2 or 3 paint jobs over the lifetime of that car. I mean, the wind would actually peel the paint off the cars if you went up highway, they called it Highway 99 in those days before the interstate. So I think the wind has always been there. And the sand dunes that were in this area were built by the winds. And so were look at Edom Hill. I mean, it's bare. There's only one reason for that, and that's the wind. So I think the wind. And then the railroad tracks were bordered by tamarack trees, clear from, I think they would start where Palm Springs Junction is all the way to Indio. They're tearing them down now because they drink too much water. But that's because of the wind. So I think, I can't say it's worse now than before. More people live in the wind than they ever did. They suffer more. This is a windy area, and that was me. And I think I wrote to Luke. I remember I was the last postmaster, among the last postmasters in the United States, appointed by the President of the United States. I was the last postmaster of Palm Desert, promoted by the President. After my appointment, they stopped appointing postmasters. Richard Nixon became president in 1969, and he said he wanted nothing to do with that anymore. And they began the process of creating the United States Postal Service. And from there on in, everybody that was appointed by the Postmaster General after being nominated by their district manager. So I will show you those certificates if you want to see them, but because I have a Lyndon Johnson and very few people have something like that.
How did you become the postmaster? Assigned by the president. How did that
Okay,
happen?
that's a good story. I was already a postal employee, as I mentioned. I came in 1963. That was the year John Kennedy was killed. November of that year, and it's interesting because it's got a connection to the desert. Not only did he visit our desert a couple of times, but the man who saved his life in the South Pacific was a postal employee in Cathedral City, or Rancho Mirage, Cathedral City. His name was Pappy. I'll think of his name. We can look it up. And when John Kennedy died, Robert Kennedy got involved when there was a vacancy, and they named him without any discussion to be the postmaster of Cathedral City. And he and I became good friends, and I don't remember his name.
Pappy?
Pappy was his first name, that's what they called him.
It wasn't Harrington, right?
No.
Say that name again.
Patrick McMahon was a PT-109 shipmate of John F. Kennedy. When the ship cut in half, Pappy hauled him. Kennedy was wounded to the islands and cared for him, but he hauled him literally, saved his life. And he was the oldest shipmate. That's why they called him Pappy. Nice man. But anyway, I got lost a little bit. I started in 1963, and Palm Desert was growing. It was only a postmaster an assistant postmaster, and then employees. And it got so large, so fast, they needed a supervisor. So they took a supervisor examination, and I passed it, and I was selected by my postmaster, Carol Lajani, to become a supervisor. And then it continued to grow, where I had only carriers to supervise. Now I had the clerks and carriers, another station that they built, a temporary station, where the it's on, well, I'll think of the name of the market that's there. And I used to be at the Andrews Market and became something else. Well, it's not important. We had a station, we put all the carriers over there, so now I had 2 buildings to supervise. So I became a superintendent of mails, which is kind of the chief operating officer of a post office. The postmaster does a political thing with the Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, et cetera. The assistant postmaster does the finances. The other guy reports to work at 5 and doesn't go home until the last dog is dead. He's the hard worker. So the vacancy came up because the postmaster, Mr. Lajani, town was growing so fast that he was getting headaches. He didn't know how to schedule people. He was in over his head. So he said he's going to quit, and he's going to quit on a certain date. And he told the Postal Service. So they needed an acting postmaster, they needed somebody, and that was a political appointee. So John Tunney was the congressman of the area, John Barrick Tunney. And tradition held, or the law held, I'm not sure, the congressman of the area appointed the postmasters with the advice and consent of the local committee, Democratic Central Committee. So he asked for people to apply, any and all people. So I did not apply, thinking I could never be the postmaster. My God, that's a big job. But I was doing all the work. And I found out who was applying, a local guy that was a hairdresser, a guy that was worked at a meat market, a real estate agent, and some other nice people, good business people. But they didn't. I would have to do more than my job if they got the job, because they knew nothing. So I applied. So the requirement was 2 letters of recommendation. So one of them I got from the superintendent of schools at Coachella Valley School District, Charles Pryor. The other one was from the assistant postmaster, who was a good citizen. So they wrote letters to the congressman. And so I got on to the final 10. So we had to go to Idlewild to meet with the committee, to stand before them, and for them to ask us questions. They had about 10 or 12 of them in a row like that, L-shaped row. We stood in the middle by ourselves, and then we went to a waiting room. Next person go in, next person go in. And they asked us questions. The concern that the community had, and there was already some rumbles in some local papers that I was the only minority in that group of people, that the only reason that Tunney liked me is because I was a minority, Mexican American, and that I was good friends with Cesar Chavez and the American Farm Labor Union, et cetera, et cetera. Those rumors are already out. So they asked me those questions, and I told them the same thing that you'll see in a letter that I wrote years later about why I'm a patriot, about World War I and World War II, and my brother being at the Naval Academy, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't need any farm worker union to help me in what I was doing. Plus, I was the most important person in the post office and running it today. So before that day was out, the committee got all of us together and said they're going to recommend me to be the acting postmaster because they wanted to investigate further. So I became the acting postmaster in July of 1968. The Marion Tool situation came up in July of 68, a month after that. I think that was right.
September?
Of 68. Right, it was right after that. That's right. So that was my first getting out in the field and meeting with the folks who wanted to do something. And I was an acting postmaster, but I had all the rights and privileges of a postmaster. So I became postmaster October 4th, 1968, by Lyndon Johnson. That was after I was investigated by the postal inspectors and by the FBI. A retired FBI agent came to see me, said that he was given the task of investigating my background as to whether I was involved in un-American activities, et cetera, which a union is not un-American. So I was appointed postmaster. Palm Desert Post, or the Desert Sun, Desert Sun may have been, wrote big articles about me being a Mexican American, and that may have been the reason. At the same time, the postmaster of Palm Springs was appointed with no problems. He was the chief of police of Palm Springs, and he was appointed postmaster. He lasted a year before he was in over his head. I trained him, by the way. I'd go over there once a week to tell him what to do, how to do it. But anyway, those things, when you look back, I thank the Lord that I was given that test, because further tests came later on in life. But I was asked by the Postal Service to be their first manager of equal employment opportunity in San Francisco. Excuse me again.
Yeah, sure.
And that was because of the good fight, not the bad fight. That we did our job, and we did it under those circumstances. So in 1972, Richard Nixon passed a law, the Equal Employment Act of 1972, 68 and 72. And they needed every federal agency to have a coordinator to see what was going on with the minority community in this country. At that time, I was a member of the Western region of the Postal Service, 13 Western states. Knew nothing about civil rights. So all I knew was the Postal Service, football and baseball. I knew labor relations and those kinds of things that you learn. I went to college for labor relations. So they asked me through a search committee, through application, to serve as the first equal employment coordinator for the Western region. So I got to visit offices in Colorado, Wyoming. Didn't go to Alaska for that. They didn't let me go to Hawaii. That was part of my area. But all the other Western states, I had to go to visit the large cities to see what their makeup was. And it was all white employees, no women letter carriers. Women, if they were employed, they were worked on the window only to sell stamps. So it was all male, white-dominated institution, like all institutions were as we grew up in the 30s and 40s and 50s, including schools. So we made some noise there, and my career continued on. But I became postmaster for 3 or 4 years, and it was good adventure, because I got to join the JCs, got to be in the committee to incorporate Palm Desert, was named a member of the Riverside County School Board, which I served until I had to go to San Francisco. So in a very and I had 4 children. Every year we'd have another child. That was my wife's responsibility. But it was a real active 4 years in Palm Desert. Started the first women's softball team. I started that. I got pictures of those kids. Some of them are grown up now here in Palm Desert. You can sure have those. That's it on that question, I think.